Sometimes this book is available on eBay or on Amazon, and it's called Japanese Tea Wares. And it's the book I would go for if the house caught on fire. I have looked at that book for probably 15 years, and I swear every time I open it, somebody has put new pictures in it. I can't believe how many amazing tea bowls there are in there, and how over time certain ones take my eye when I open the book. So I want to talk about them, and you'll notice that there's a really wide range of aesthetics involved in these tea bowls. Some of them, you think, I've seen a tea bowl like that back in the kill room under a sign that says, if these pieces aren't gone by Saturday, we're going to throw them away. And you think, but this is a national treasure. And it's just a matter of looking at things and learning from them. So a variety of work. Two basic types of tea bowls. Open ones are summer tea bowls, and winter tea bowls are straighter to hold in the heat. This helps cool the tea. These are all vessels that require two hands for picking up and drinking, not a gesture that we grow up using in this culture. So you get a sense of how the tea feels, how the warmth comes through the bowl, whether the tea bowl is smooth and you feel it directly, whether it's more casual and thicker. Here's a tea bowl that's totally different from the one before. The other one was very precisely decorated. This is a wood-fired tea bowl. While the pot was being fired, it was either fired upside or on its side, or there might have been a little patch of clay leaned against the side of that bowl. And also, we know that it was in firebox area, probably along the side of the kiln, and where wood was thrown in very close to it and turned to charcoal, because those colors are indicative of being close to burning embers. A really good example of hakame. Hakame is a white slip casually brushed under a thin, clear glaze. Something that everybody at some point falls in love with and tries to make happen with a whisk broom or some kind of textured brush that lets you look through the glaze and see the slip that was modified. And of course, with a lot of tea bowls, if you're drinking tea from them, depending on the opacity of the tea, or if it's coffee, it's opaque, more of the bowl becomes visible as you drink. So it's like a little ritual. Okay, here's a very complex bowl with some crystal overglaze painted on there. This is a Shino glaze. This is mostly feldspar. It also is a stoneware clay body, and it has an iron wash under the glaze. Sometimes these pieces are not bisque fired. if they are bisque fired, sometimes they're fired to a low temperature because those little pock marks in there are due to off-gassing coming out of the clay. And I'm finding that you can induce this with the right kind of Shino by just hitting it with a hand torch before you glaze it, after it's bisqued. You just draw a little pattern with a torch on the bisque-fired bowl and then glaze it immediately. And when you pull it out of the glaze, or when the glaze goes away, you'll see that there are little holes that come up onto the surface of the dry glaze, and those holes stay there. So where the glaze is most opaque, it is thicker, of course. And what I don't understand is the linear marks, like these things. And are they just dots connecting? Like here's two dots in a line. It's like some kind of mystical language. And I have a cup that I just made a little while ago that I really enjoy using. And it's exactly the kind of cup I would have hated 30 years ago. And I would have written to Ceramics Monthly and said, how can I get rid of these pinholes in this glaze? And now I want to know how to make really good pinholes. So I know that it can't happen on porcelain. It has to happen on a coarse clay, preferably one that has grog or coarse sand in it. And so I'm looking for it. There's a story about Harvey Littleton, who is a very famous glass blower, who was so delighted when he discovered how to put air bubbles in the glass that he was blowing. And he couldn't wait to tell his mother. And he told her, and she said, Harvey, your father spent his entire life getting rid of bubbles in glass at a windshield factory in Toledo, Ohio. That was his whole thrust of what he was up to. Whoop. A really good example of a summer Teabowl. The subtlety of this glaze isn't quite available to us, but it has remarkable large crystal growths. And not only are they crystalline, they're also iridescent. Chinese Teabowls, the original ones that took everybody's attention, were each fired in a single sagger because they fired their kills with coal. And they didn't want the coal ash to get on the pots. Coal ash is totally different. It's very refractory, doesn't melt down the way ash glaze does. So every Teabowl had its own sagger, and that meant that it cooled down more slowly because of the mass of the thick sagger around it. Also, it meant that they had to stack them up. So the saggers themselves are wonderful bits of engineering. If you can imagine this being in a little container, and the foot of the container above it would go right down close to, but not touching, the bowl. And so they made terrific use of space when they were stacking the saggers up. Okay, this is a glaze that's just very dusky above the opaque part. The dusky light part of the glaze has pulled away from the rim. That's a temaku with another glaze over it, porcelain or a white burning stoneware body. Here's another one. This is This is a beautiful painting of streams. They just look like slashes here, but very nice brushwork. This is a typical winter Teabowl, steep sides, Temaku, black, very subtle coloration. You know, the texture of a glaze is something that's so important in Teabowls. You know, some black glazes are quite shiny because they have a lot of iron in them. The iron acts as a flux over 6%, and depending on what else is in the glaze, clay, say, it gives it more body and less glassiness. So it's this kind of thing. Most potters who have worked for a while can look at a Teabowl and figure out how it feels. It's just one of the things that happens to us from working. Sometimes we see things and we think we know how it's going to feel, and then we touch it and it's different. There's one of those glazed plates over there that's that way. It has a kind of gold foil look to it, and it looks as though it might be shiny, and you touch it and it feels like a horse's nose or an old pool table with the felt worn down. And it's a visual trick, and it's nice to come up with that confirmation when you touch it. Okay, here's a little high-footed bowl with a chino glaze of some sort that's crackling up. Looks like a glaze defect to some eyes, and that's okay. It's how we think about things. As we work, we find our tastes become more liberal or pliant or stretchy, and we enjoy things for their own sake. It took me a really long time to get to that point, and a lot of garbage cans filled with things that didn't please me and that I wasn't ready to see for what they were. And so now I don't make too many snap judgments when we unload the kill, because I've really proved myself wrong so many times by making a judgment on something early and then a couple weeks later pick up the same pot and find that something miraculous has happened to it. Of course, what's happened is that my seeing is improved. Okay, painted Teabowl, low fire after high firing. This is an iron blue glaze. There has no cobalt been put in that glaze. It's an iron blue. People in Australia are uncanny at making glazes like this. They just are smashing up rocks. They know what kind of rocks to look for, and making their own glazes. There's a guy named Cole Levy, very reclusive guy, a brilliant glaze master, and he's able to make this kind of blue glaze. Now, here's another defective glaze. How do you get your glazes to defect like that? They're wonderful. They're so tactile. And we all grow up with the assumption that ceramics ought to be smooth. There shouldn't be this kind of irregularity. And that's because we grow up using industrially sanctioned surfaces. And it makes it very difficult for us to enjoy something like this for its sake without something happening to us. Most people would not choose this Teabowl to use out of a line of Teabowls that were all glazed smooth. It just takes a special person to look at that thing and consider it to have aesthetic merit. And we grow into that thing. Like, as I said yesterday, like kimchi or tofu or Bartok string quartets. They're things that they maybe scrape on our nerves at first, and then we come to enjoy them for what they are. Here's another one. Nice glaze that tells us something about the character of the clay. The right-hand side of that has almost no glaze on it. It's almost completely bare clay. But somebody has pushed it out from the inside. You know how a rough clay can respond by stretching, by pushing on the inside, and that has that tactile quality, contrasting to the glazed piece part on the side, which is very deliberate in the placement of it. And here's another one. This is just a couple of stripes going past there. Yeah, don't know about this one. Probably some titanium ground up and wedged into the clay, pushing through that cover glaze. This is a very classic Chinese Teabowl, Chen style, and the glaze is meant to pull down by gravity, and down at the bottom, just above the foot, there's a place where the glaze will just gather like a fat roll, and it'll just hang there. And those are highly prized. And they particularly happen when the pieces are fired in saggers. Well, this is a very boxy kind of Teabowl, very gutsy to pick that up and drink out of it. And you'll notice how low the foot is casts a shadow. So it gives a sense of the Teabowl floating on its little foot. It's not quite square, it's not quite round. The rim is not a dead true circle. It's more like a horizon. And when I worked in Tokoname, the Teabowls that some potters were making were irregular like that, and they were irregular in a way that matched the terrain. So when you looked up from down at the bay, you saw the hillsides going around, and they very consciously wanted to put that into the cup. So when you drank out of it, it was a metaphor for drinking from the village, from the geological space. This is an oribe cup. Oribe is often considered to be the most playful style of decorating. Sometimes oribe where it looks as though several people decorated it, and that was just passed down a line and somebody made a few brush marks. Sometimes it's more deliberate, and almost always the glaze is green and bright, but this one is a black oribe. That's another pot very much like the second one we saw. It has a natural ash glaze, and it's like looking through a little window to see the actual clay. Some people feel the bare clay with their tongues, like that line in the Wallace Stevens poem, the tongue is an eye. And so that's the most intimate way to get to know the clay. And here are some really marvelous birds, wonderful painting. And here's another glaze. A glaze like this is almost pure feldspar. So there's been a lot of study about the techniques of making these glazes. And most people agree that the early Shinos were not highly refined. They were just ground up rocks, highly feldspathic rocks. And so this is probably mostly feldspar and sometimes some salt in it to get it to stick. Here's another Shino. This kind of glaze doesn't have a really smooth feeling to it. It's more like an eggshell. It's more like it needs a couple more cones to get shiny. And that would be overfiring in the mind of the maker. So there's iron painted under it. Glaze is gathering up in little globules. Very distinct tactile presence. Other one, painting. I'm only going to talk about the ones that we can see. This is another pot that's fired down by a stoking zone on the side of the kiln. And there would have been a little piece of charcoal down there where that gray is burned away. And then the clay is very sensitive. This is probably a Bizen pot. Very smooth, high shrinkage clay. Exquisite sensitivity to atmosphere and flame. Yeah, this has got a lot of texture that you probably can't see, and a black glaze. This might be a hikidashi piece. Hikidashi pieces are treated like raku, but they're pulled out of a kiln on a long rod with a fork on the end that goes under the bowl, and they're lifted out and they're taken out at about cone 9 or cone 10. And then they're usually cooled in a little box with sawdust in it. Very much in the manner of raku, but at high temperature. Hikidashi. This is another one of those glazes with the disappearing foot hovering there, almost like a Shaner red glaze. This is a glaze with exquisite crystals in it, probably a lot of titanium, very smooth, amazing tactile presence because the little crystals feel one way and the background color feels another way. And this, I forget the name of this. This is a technique that some potters are experimenting with. Pam Lau is really interested in this right now. It has something to do with gas coming off the clay, and it makes those little pinkish spots. Maybe you've seen some pots with that effect. This piece is from Hagi. Hagiaki is made in the lower part of Japan, and the clay is really particular to it. One time I got a little Hagi cup, and the translation said, "Don't be surprised if this doesn't look like real Hagiaki, because it has to go through 7 color changes as you use it. So over time, the cup is going to change, and it's going to have something to do with the tea you drink from it, and just an aging process. If we can take one thing for granted that we grow up with when we work with clay, it's that that picture sitting over there is going to be the same picture in 40 years. You know, it's not going to change. Hagiaki is not. It challenges that difference. It's going to change. Here's another one. These are organic spots that are happening in the clay body to influence the glaze. Very subtle differences. This is an ash glaze applied, hard to see. This is also hard to talk about. This has a tiny stamped patterns in it, pretty much influenced by Korean pots. This is a glaze whose color comes from difference in thickness and where it was in the kill. That's all I can tell you. Red. This is a really gutsy one too. This is perhaps a Kuranuki piece. Easy to imagine this piece being carved out of a single lump of clay. No attempt to smooth over the the cuts, almost like they were made with a little adze. So the interesting thing about these pots is that they're not made when the clay is completely wet. They're allowed to dry, and in different stages, anytime you touch the clay with a tool or take some of the clay away, it's going to leave a different kind of mark. So it's going to improve the feel of the piece after it's been fired, after it's been glazed. We know that that is a pretty hefty pot. We look at the thickness of the rim. We know about how much it would weigh to pick up. So not all Teabowls are really delicate little translucent things. Here's another Shino Teabowl, and the white part is probably from a double application. It's on stoneware clay with an iron wash, and then double thickness where it's white. And high fire glazed piece. Another high fire glazed piece with some copper over it. Another wood fired glazed piece with two patches where it's close to another piece, or they often lean a little slab of clay up against a piece to act as a foil for flame coming in. Very conventional shape. Everybody makes shapes like this. Good practical shape. Here's another crawling Shino glaze. I think it takes years for people to get to appreciate things like this, if it's going to happen. It's fun though. I've had this sail at home for years, 40-some years, and twice I've got a couple Hamada cups, and twice I've put the Hamada cups in my sail with no price on them, and nobody ever picked them up. They look so different from my pots that they didn't bother. I thought, what was he doing with this one? So I don't know what they thought, but they never picked it up, and they certainly didn't know it was a Hamada cup. But Lewis Riley was there one time, and Lewis is out in Kansas City now, and I just put these cups out one time. We were having tea out on the porch, and I put the Hamada cup there, and Lewis happened to pick it up, and then he started to look at it, and he said, "Jack, is this what I think it is?" And I said, "Yeah," and he said, "Oh." I mean, it just made his year. He was so astonished. And he wrote to me a month ago saying that he was able to buy a Hamada cup, and it just made him feel so good. Another time, when we were building the kill, I had some helpers come, and I put the Hamada cup out with some other cups, and we're having a glass of wine in the afternoon. And I left the room, and when I came back, a young woman had chosen the Hamada cup, and she said, "Jack, is this really by Hamada?" And I said, "Yeah." And she said, "Well, I'm not touching it." I said, "Really?" She wouldn't pick it up. I said, "Oh, Mr. Hamada would be so disappointed that you didn't want to drink from his cup." She said, "No, if anybody would goof up and drop it, it would be me, and I don't want to have anything to do with that." I thought, okay, I'm respectful. But it was an odd response, I thought. Okay, here's another pretty hefty Teabowl, very rocky, very stony. Some kind of Shino on a very coarse clay, and another one, very subtle how much of this is clay, how much of this is glaze. That's a wonderful tactile piece. Looks kind of dry, kind of smooth. Yeah, here's a right screen. Looks like it. Glazed cup. Another one, sort of a glazed foil. This looks like a glazed cup put in a wood kiln, and the fire came back perhaps from two cups that were acting as baffles. So the middle of it gets a more energetic flow. It's another kind of pinkish chino on a light colored clay. I think this is a raku Teabowl, steep sides, winter Teabowl. Here's one of those with a leaf in it. Somebody told me that they were mulberry leaves that you fire right into the glaze. And I've never seen anybody do that in this country. There has to be some kind of a temoku glaze that will support that leaf. And whatever is in the leaf is just fired, and the glaze is totally smooth. It's just the image of the leaf. Here's another transparent wood ash glaze. It flows down, and see that nice little line down there? And it just catches that line and directs the glaze. Very casual approach. Another Teabowl. It's a glazed cup. One with a little scene. Man in a boat, two men in the other boat. This is almost like alabaster, almost like obsidian, I mean. Very casual. You know, it might be made by an 80-year-old guy who has just gotten over his years of making precise little Teabowls, maybe having a go. Maybe he's made this kind of work his whole life. Here's another crackle chino. Very tactile glaze. More graphic design. Another leaf. Isn't it neat how, I mean, that's a real leaf. And why didn't the leaf just burn away and slide down to the bottom? I don't know. Little tricks. There's all kinds of tricks. A lot of brushwork. Another glaze with little pinholes. I'll just show you a couple more here because they're basically variations on a few techniques. Probably some iron or ochre or dark burning clay painted over a white glaze. And here's another really intriguing glaze. It looks like it's still molten, still melting, almost a texture of plastic. It has that look to it, but there's a lot to feel. You know, when you go to a tea ceremony in a little house, it's quite dark. There's no bright lights. It's a contemplative space to be in. And the sense of it heightens the sense of touch, and that's important when someone hands you a Teabowl. Okay, this is nice. This is called nezume shino. Nezume means mouse or rat in Japanese, and there would be iron painted on this piece. That's what makes it that blue-gray color. And then it could have been scraped away or put on over a wax pattern, so it's just white. And this is really an elegant little bowl, oxidized copper glaze. Sometimes the glazes we want to be copper red come out this color. Well, thank you very much. This gives you a sense of some of the possibilities for tea wares. And they go on and on and on, as you'll see when you start looking around at more of them. Good. Okay, thank you.